All right, so I'm going to actually assign the introduction to the book for next week, and it covers a lot of this really well, but I did want to just make a few points of a historical nature to kind of get us into this new part of the course in medieval political thought. We've already learned a little bit about the Roman Empire through St. Augustine, right, and the conversion of the Romans to Christianity. Now, as the Romans grew in power, one thing that we need to know is that they absorbed the Greek culture and, most importantly, the Greek philosophy. And they attempted to build on it, although, for the most part, they did not surpass it, but interpreted it and, in some cases, applied it in a different way to their own purposes. Okay, but by doing that, they preserved it. Okay, and it's through the Romans initially that the Europeans had some access to this as the Roman Empire moved into and took over Europe. Okay, but there were two things that happened. Okay, one of which was the advent of Christianity and its adoption as the official religion of the Roman Empire. From the early 3rd century on, there was some hostility amongst a lot of the prominent Christian thinkers to dealing with Greek philosophy, okay? Because it was not Christian, of course, but pagan in its origin. And so there was a strain of thought that was pretty strong that basically said, we don't need philosophy, okay? And so actually looked down on it or even saw it as sinful simply because it seemed kind of like a sign of human pride. You remember Augustine struggled with that and basically came to the conclusion that he still would use it to some extent, but that the revelation of Christ did supersede it. And so too much reliance on philosophy for Augustine even was a sign of arrogance and pride. Okay, so there was that. And then also in the late 3rd century, there was a split of the Roman Empire into the eastern and the western parts, and there were 2 emperors. And the eastern became the Byzantine Empire, and it encompassed Greece, what was Greece and Turkey, okay? Or part of Turkey, I should say, northern Turkey, what we now know as Turkey. So they continued to be able to read, learn, and study the Greek philosophers. Okay? But the Western Empire, with its different focus, with its different orientation, did not so much. Okay, so there was that. And it was the Western Roman Empire which dominated parts of Europe. Okay? And as you know, even in Augustine's time, the barbarians were fighting back. The European tribes were fighting back. And over time, they became stronger and the Roman Empire became weaker. Okay? And the Western Roman Empire began to slowly crumble. Its power, its unified power in Europe began to fade. Okay? And so this even furthered the decline of knowledge of the works of philosophy and literature from Greece in Europe. Okay? So you all probably have heard the term the Dark Ages, right? And what that refers to, even though we don't actually agree that the Dark Ages were truly dark, but what that refers to is a lack of acquaintance with, a lack of contact with the ancient world, the ancient philosophy, ancient literature, ancient artwork, and so forth. Okay? And furthermore, the vast illiteracy of most people. So what learning did exist for a long period of time was concentrated in the church, okay, in Europe, and even to them, access to the old works was very rare. Okay, so you may think, well, why is that a problem? Well, it was quite a problem because it was through those texts that they would have had access not only to philosophy but to more sophisticated mathematics, scientific concepts, and so forth. So if they had had ready access to those, they might have made much more progress in technology, in government, and so forth than they did for a long period of time. Okay? So there was about 1,000 years in Europe in which the feudal system is developing, but in which the texts and ideas of the ancient Greeks and Romans, the Latin translations of the Greek works were also largely unavailable, where these things were not known. Okay? Your introduction says that there was a significant exception to this in that they had the Latin translation of Platos Timaeus, which is interesting because Timaeus deals with cosmic things. It deals with the origins of the world and of the universe and the idea of a God, a creator God, and a world soul. It also deals with the Platonic elements, and some of those ideas were of influence in Europe in the Middle Ages, and helped to develop that Neoplatonic school of thought that we've talked about before. And Platonic ideas about numbers were picked up, and so you have some what we call numerology develop in Europe. But there wasn't enough there. They had some part of the Republic that came with Timaeus, some ideas from the Republic came with their translation of Timaeus, and they knew something about the three classes that appear in the Republic. And so this was a Platonic teaching that had some resonance with them because they began to think very much in terms of classes and class structure. Okay? But they didn't have access to very much. And at the same time, in the Eastern, the Byzantine Empire, there was full access to all of this, okay? From the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and Roman thinkers like Cicero, who attempted to develop those ideas more. And so, they were in Turkish hands, they were in Northern Africa, the Arab world, okay? And so, in the Arab world, they continued to be studied, they continued to be developed, and actually the Arab thinkers tried to mesh, especially Aristotle's thought, with Islamic thought, in much the same way that much later Thomas Aquinas tries to mesh Aristotle's thought with Christian theology. Okay? So the Arab world had a sort of Renaissance period of intellectual growth because of this. But the Europeans did not at this time. And what's really interesting, and what you probably already know, is that one of the main reasons why these classics were rediscovered and reintroduced into Europe was due to the Muslim conquest of Spain in the 12th century. Okay? And through this, the learning, as often happens with war, war is a very negative thing, but at the same time, it brings people into contact with each other. Okay? So, with this contact, many of these old works were brought back into Europe, both in the original Greek, which people then had to try to learn, and in Latin translation. And so, the editor of your book does a good job of describing the impact of this, particularly of Aristotle's thought, as it came back. He says, while the impact of Plato's philosophy can still be measured after the fall of Roman domination, the fate of Aristotle's social and political thought followed a different trajectory. Prior to his execution, Boethius had managed to translate 2 Aristotelian treatises, the Categories and On Interpretation, into Latin, and these provided the primary source for knowledge of Aristotle well into the 12th century. While the Categories in particular contained some of the main tenets of Aristotle's moral theory, his political doctrines were inaccessible, at least directly, to early medieval thinkers. Then, because of renewed contact between Christianity and Islam in southern Europe during the 1100s, the bulk of Aristotle's work, which Islamic and Jewish scholars had studied for generations, rapidly became available to Western readers. Parts of the Nicomachean Ethics were translated into Latin before 1200, a full text appearing around 1250, while the Politics was disseminated around 1260. While it overstates matters to regard the flood of Aristotelian texts as the cause of an intellectual revolution in Western Europe, medieval political theorists quickly adopted much of the linguistic and conceptual apparatus of the Politics. Indeed, we may properly characterize Aristotle as the predominant classical figure in the political philosophy of the Middle Ages from the mid-13th century onward. Okay? And that's a reason to study Aristotle, because we find that it is the foundational non-religious work of the Western political thought, basically. Okay? So, and what you'll find in these medieval thinkers as time goes by is, yes, they're somewhat uneasy, some of them, but with, the adoption of pagan thought, but for the most part, they do it. Okay? Aristotle becomes the master, the teacher, the great intellectual who they refer to for guidance. And a lot of the late medieval and early Renaissance science uses Aristotle's thought. Okay? Now, later on in the scientific revolution, they decided that Aristotle's science was not so scientific after all, because it really was completely non-experimental. It was really based on observation and just thinking, okay? And sort of speculating about causes and so forth. But his influence was great, and for a long period of time, his ideas helped stimulate the investigation of the natural world as well as the political world. Okay? So you'll see Aristotle keep coming out in these works that you're going to be reading. And of course, the greatest influence that we'll see is on Thomas Aquinas and his development of natural law. His natural law theory has a great impact on modern natural law theory, from which we get liberalism. So you can see a connection between, you've read the Politics, so you know that Aristotle, though he's not a liberal thinker, he doesn't speak in terms of rights, he has this notion of each person being capable, or at least each male person being capable of thinking about the larger society, of participating, of needing to be a citizen, and of government incorporating everybody, and everybody having a voice. Okay? And so you can see the connection between modern liberalism and all the way back to Aristotle. And it comes through, the reintroduction of the ancient ideas into Europe. It also comes from, that is, liberalism, although this may seem a little bit strange to you, it also comes from the system of feudalism to a certain extent. So feudalism developed as the Roman Empire crumbled, and as we had Roman citizens staying in place and basically controlling certain areas in Europe, okay, without the backing and the full force of the empire. And so you get fiefdoms started, centers of power. And you also have centers of power in the old so-called barbarian chieftains of Europe, okay? And it's the relationships in both of these, okay? The relationship between the commanders and the soldiers, and the relationships between the commanders and the local chieftains that had developed, okay? So military structure, in other words, that the Roman army had long practiced. The ideas of how to conduct things still were in place as the empire waned, okay? And these people were still there. And there was this idea that, what came to be called the lords, okay, but the commanders, the people in charge, owed protection to those beneath them, and in exchange, those beneath them, okay, those who fought under their banner, so to speak, owed them loyalty and service, okay? So there was this idea of loyalty and of cooperation and of respect to your superiors, but caring to your inferiors, okay? So these basic military and tribal ideas too, the chieftain takes care of his people fight for the chieftain, they're loyal to him, okay? Those ideas carried on, and they formed the basis of the new feudal structure in Europe, okay? So where there were powerful men who held land and held sway over a certain amount of territory, they had their own little armies, right? The vassals, the lords had these men armed and ready to do their bidding, okay, and extremely loyal to them, all right, and not to any country or really any religion, although that came later on as feudalism developed more, and you get the idea of the knight, the Christian knight, who's loyal to both his lord and to God, okay. So the other influence on feudalism was the hierarchy of the church, which developed and became more complex over time. Okay? And so we have, the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops, etc. All the way down, we've got the priests and the local parish, right? And you have the same sort of relationships, okay? The people at the higher levels care for those beneath them and instruct them and tell them what to do. The people beneath are supposed to be loyal, okay? They're supposed to obey and in exchange receive protection and benefits and so forth. And for quite a long time, the church hierarchy, you might say, the people in the higher parts of the church often had political and military power too, okay? And were chosen for all kinds of reasons, including just the fact that they happened to be prominent and powerful, okay? And so they operated in somewhat the same way as these other folks did. And the people were at the bottom of this, and they too were supposed to give their loyalty and support in the form of taxes, in the form of what they produced as well, to their superiors, to support the church, to support their lords, and in exchange they were supposed to receive protection. Okay? Now you may ask, well, how is this a foundation for liberalism? Because it seems like it's all about top down, it's the orders from the top, you obey, you're loyal, you're supposed to, in effect, not have a voice. But it became more and more solidified over time that there were certain expectations for each class, each type of person, okay, was supposed to do certain things and supposed to behave in a certain way, okay? And these expectations became a basis for a standard for conduct. And the idea was that it was sort of a mutual exchange, okay, in which the powerful protected the weak and the weak supported the powerful, okay? So there's a little bit of social contract there in the feudal system, okay? And very strong expectations about how people are supposed to behave. Now, did it always happen? Not at all, especially in the early feudal period. A lot of times these lords and their men were almost like just rampaging gangs, who, because of their power, they could do whatever they wanted to do. The church was both a political and a religious institution, but one of the things that the church definitely provided and had a positive impact was the pushing of the code of chivalry. They tried to apply Christian principles and ideas to these people who otherwise would simply rule with power, and to try to rein them in and give them some moral standards to guide their behavior. But that was a struggle, to be sure. So not all went well, but still, over time, we get the development of Christian thought as well as secular political thought that speaks in terms of expectations, social expectations, how the lord should behave, okay, how the baron should behave, how the nobility should behave, how the soldiers ought to behave towards, the enemy as well as towards their own people. What's the role of the priest and of the church hierarchy? What's the role of the people? Okay. In the introduction to political thought class, we talked about the mirror style of writing. Okay. So that did develop during the Middle Ages, and it was heavily influenced by Christian theology. And the idea was that we needed to apply moral standards to each class of people so that each would know what role it was supposed to play. And by implication, we could hold them responsible then. Okay? Now, for a long time, there was no good way for the lowest class of people to hold anybody responsible. Okay? But because of the way of thinking and the framework, that had been constructed here with expectations, later on down the road, people indeed started demanding, okay, much later, that they be treated in a certain way and that these people fulfill their roles properly. Okay? In the feudal system, there were overlapping areas of authority. Okay? So it was a bit difficult, and Karl Marx points this out in the manifesto, actually, a bit difficult to figure out always who the authority was and over what. And this was particularly true between the church and the secular rulers. Okay? So there were frequently questions about, for instance, who chooses the priest? Who decides who will be a bishop or a cardinal? Should it be the pope or should it be the prince? Okay? Well, that wasn't a foregone conclusion. And sometimes it happened both ways, okay? Depending on who was most powerful or most assertive. Okay? Church leaders had fiefdoms like regular lords who decided what they would have. Okay? And who decided what they should do with it? Them or the lord, the nobles. Okay? Who would decide who was the legitimate heir of a ruler? Would it be the ruler himself or the church? Okay? So from very early on, there was difficulty deciding, does the church have power over these things or not? Okay? What's the role of the church and what's the role of the state? Okay? The big question that went on throughout the Middle Ages. Okay? So it was not a surprise in the early modern and going on into the Enlightenment period that this was still a question and it needed to be resolved. Right? You know from studying Machiavelli how politicized the church could be in different parts of the world, and church leaders tried to assert themselves into matters that others might have thought were not their concern. Okay? And vice versa. You don't often hear about it, but political leaders tried to determine who would be the bishop in their area, who would be the pope, as a matter of fact. Okay? So it went both ways. Over time, these relationships and these expectations became more and more legalistic. Okay? There's more and more structure and a legal system emerging, which wasn't universally accessible to everybody. Okay? The expectations were different for the nobles and for the common people. And the law didn't, in a lot of cases, apply to the common people in the same way. But there was a growing sense within this structure that there were certain rights based upon position. Okay? So if you were a member of the noble class, you had certain rights, or you might say privileges. The term rights wasn't around yet. But you had certain privileges because you were of that class. Okay? And if you were a member of the clergy, you had certain privileges because you were a member of that class. Okay? And even with the people, you had certain protections, or you were supposed to, because you were a member of the class. You were a member of the people. Okay? So I guess I would use that term with some skepticism, but certainly there was a sense of entitlements based upon class, and this became a big theme in the political thought. Okay? What should those entitlements or rights, if you want to put it that way, be? Okay? What should people's roles be? All right, so it's in that context that we get this piece by Marie de France that I asked you to read for this week. And it's very short, right? And you might wonder, why are we reading this? Because it's a children's tale, supposedly, right? But it's actually quite emblematic of the political thought of the Middle Ages, okay? Because it deals with society as an organic body, okay? Each part depending on the other. Okay? So, I'll talk a little bit about who she was. And I like this because I think if you study medieval political thought and philosophy, you find that there's more than one woman that appears in this history and whose works we have access to. And until I studied this area of political thought, I was under the impression that women didn't do anything prior to modern times. But that's simply not true. Okay? What was the case was that ordinary women who didn't have access to education, they weren't literate, they couldn't do these things. So for women, as well as for men, really the only people who could be intellectuals, who could write and be published and be discussed, were either members of the nobility or of the clergy, okay? Because those were the two groups that could receive an education and be literate and actually be taken seriously, right? So what we know about Marie is that she was a poet and that she retold Aesop's fables and translated them into French, okay? And it's from the Aesop's Fables that we have her excerpt here. She also retold a legend about St. Patrick in Purgatory. Okay? We also know that she was not a nun, so by implication she had to be a member of the noble class. Right? But as it says there, being a nun was a significant avenue during the Middle Ages for women to pursue the life of learning. And if you look back at church history, you find there were women of letters who contributed quite a bit. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, if she's retelling Aesop's Fables, and she's all the way in France, where does she get her hands on something like that?
Well, it was one of those Greek works, probably translated into Latin. I think she had the Latin translation that was coming from, the reintroduction of these works into Europe.
So her family just, somehow just got their hands on it and she translated it?
Yeah, these were wealthy people who could acquire copies of works. And, these would have been works that were copied by hand, so there weren't a lot of them. But these were people who could put their hands on them. And she, as we'll see, she had friends in high places. Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, I'm sure she or her family bought it from somebody who was able to put their hands on it. And they started to develop libraries of these works. So when I said that she had friends in high places, I meant this, that she served at the court of Henry II and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Eleanor was, of course, very wealthy and powerful and kind of positioned herself as a person who would encourage the learning of these works. So she collected them. Right? And in her court, she made philosophers and writers and artists welcome. And so it was well known as a place where intellectuals could come and discuss freely, because that's what she wanted. So she was a great patron of this type of activity. you can look her up and you'll find a lot of interesting material on Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Eleanor herself has an interesting history. You could probably say without Eleanor, the advancement of learning would have been slower in France and then later on in England. Here's what she did. She first married Louis VII, okay? And they had 2 daughters and no sons, and their marriage was annulled, okay, by the agreement of both, probably because she wasn't able to bear, or he didn't think she was going to be able to bear a son. And maybe because she didn't want to be married anymore, because she seems like the type that could make that decision. By looking at her history, you get an idea of how different life was for members of the very top classes at this time. Because there's no way a woman at a lower rank in society could decide for herself whether to divorce or remarry. Okay? Then we know that she actually proposed to the Duke of the Normans, Henry Plantagenet, who was 11 years younger than her, which is very unusual too. Both the proposal and the fact that it was taken seriously, which was probably based upon her history, and she seemed like an attractive woman. Right? And he said yes. And Henry later on became King of England. So Eleanor ended up being a woman who had been both Queen of France and Queen of England. And she carried on her patronage of intellectual and artistic pursuits. With Henry, she had 5 sons. And it was through Eleanor, probably, that Marie de France was supported. And it's probably through her that she got the book, okay, among many other books. Okay. But would Marie have been from the lower classes? No, she would have been definitely a member of the nobility from a wealthy family. Would she have been able to pursue this activity without Eleanor's help? Perhaps, okay? Because if she had a supportive family, a supportive husband, which she must have had, then she probably could have done it anyway. But the atmosphere and the resources supplied by Eleanor of Aquitaine greatly supported her and other people. So you think that, nobody was doing anything during this period of time. No, wrong. And by the way, this was a great achievement, okay? Nowadays we tend to not, distinguish between daughters and sons, and that's good. But back then, a woman who had 5 sons had accomplished everything she needed to in life before she ever wrote a single word. So Eleanor was a success in all areas, right? Because with sons, you have heirs, right? And you have people to carry on your family position and your family money. So she truly achieved everything that people could admire at that time. And having studied some other women thinkers who, around this time and later, they didn't all have a supportive atmosphere like this to work in, or a supportive husband, and some of them were not treated as well as Marie de France probably was, so we need to keep that in mind. Now, let's look at this short fable. Okay, I'm just going to read it since it's really short, just to kind of... It says, "Of a man I wish to tell, as an example to remember, of his hands and of his feet and of his head. They were angry towards the belly that he carried about their earnings that it ate." Towards the belly that he carried, about their earnings that it ate. "Then they would not work anymore, and they deprived it of its food. But when the belly fasted, they were quickly weakened. Hands and feet had no strength to work now as they were accustomed. Food and drink they offered the belly, but they starved it too long. It did not have the strength to eat, The belly dwindled to nothing, and the hands and feet went too. The head's missing there. From this example, one can see what every free person ought to know. No one can have honor who brings shame to his Lord, nor can his Lord have it either if he wishes to shame his people. If either one fails the other, evil befalls them both. So, we think this was a Roman add-on to the Aesop's Fables, okay? Which just means that in the original, this particular story didn't exist, but in the Latin translation it did, so they figured that this is an add-on, and the original fable is told by a Roman official. So, but she changes it further, okay? She adds her own twist in her particular version of it, okay? Well, let's talk about what it might represent, because this was a very common image. You know, have you seen the cover of Hobbes's original Leviathan? Okay. In that cover, which was from the 16th century, you have this picture of a king, and within the king there are many little people inside of it. Okay? And it just kind of shows you how long and strong this type of image was, because it conveys the same sort of message. You know, the king is made up of the people, and they're sort of mutually interdependent upon each other. But in this particular version, what does the body as a whole represent? What did you think? The what?
People, probably.
Okay.
Comprise the kingdom.
Okay. The body as a whole. Anybody else?
Yeah, I felt it was just the state as a whole.
Okay. That's probably, when we say the people, I know you think the country as a whole, but for these people, the common people, were one part, okay? And so probably the body as a whole would be the state, right? The kingdom itself, okay? And what about the head and the belly and the limbs? Well, you would kind of think that the king or prince would be the head, but then that turns out not to be true, because it's the belly who starves, and the moral seems to be you've just, by refusing to obey, you have killed your Lord, more or less. So what would the head be? It's not well explained in the fable, so you have to kind of guess.
Church.
Okay, most likely the church, because the church is the source of standards. The church is the source of a lot of intellectual output as well, right? So you might say the church and other the thinking part, okay, of society, which is kind of interesting because it's not the same as the belly. What's the belly?
Nobility, perhaps?
Yeah, the noble class, right? These are the leaders, right? So she distinguishes, I think, between the head, which is the church and maybe other members of the thinking class or the intellectual class, and the belly, which are the lords. Now, there may be overlap, and there is overlap, right? But they're two distinct roles, okay? And what about the hands and feet? Right, they're the common people, right? So, but they're all together and they're all mutually interdependent. That's the idea why they talk about the body politic, because it's one body and they're all dependent. Not one part can operate without all the others being healthy, okay? So, say that the story says that the hands, feet, and head are all angry, okay? About why? Why are they all angry at the belly?
Feeding it?
They are not feeding it because they're angry, but why do they stop feeding it?
Getting what they want from the nobles?
Okay. Yeah. It says that the belly eats all of their earnings, and they don't like it, right? This translates into, the taxation and, taking what they have. These would have been serfs, they would have been farmers, right? Craftsmen. And the nobles basically took from them what they needed. They would take their food, okay? They would leave them enough to live on, but they would take what they wanted, either through direct taking or through taxation, okay? And of course, like in all times, people resented this, especially if it seemed to them to be abusive, okay? If maybe they weren't left with enough, to be able to take care of themselves properly. They resented the power of the nobles, and they looked at them as more or less living off of them, like a parasite almost, okay? And so when they look at it that way, they say to themselves, well, we're just not going to feed you anymore. Now, in real life, that wouldn't happen, right? Because the nobles had the power, so they would make them. And it's not unlikely that people would go on some sort of strike, as it seems to be depicted here. But this is probably what you might say they might like to do, if they could do. Say, no, we're not going to do this for you anymore. We're going to let you fend for yourself, right? And then what happens is, she says, or the fable says, it becomes, the nobles, the belly becomes weak, and then what happens?
They'll start to die off.
Yeah, because they're all interconnected, as it turns out, right? So when the belly is no longer being fed, and then it becomes too weak to really be able to digest its food when it's fed again, then the person becomes sick, right? So the hands and the feet and the head are all affected by that. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mention anything about the head.
No, it doesn't. You're right. Yeah, it leaves that out. Do you have any guesses to why?
I assume maybe the church is more independent of like one specific state, since it's so spread throughout the entire civilization.
Yeah, so it might not fit too well in this overall analogy. If it can, better than the people, take care of itself, that's a good possibility. Yeah.
Another possibility why the head might not be featured is that in a lot of cases, especially in those times, the nobility and the church worked more closely together, and if nobility was like either buying off people or, giving some of the money they get from the taxpayers, like, to the church for special reasons. So it's like the church might be more okay with the nobility than like the common people would be.
Well, but Marie seemed to be okay with the nobility as well. And I mean, to the extent that the church was dependent on the nobility, which it was to some extent, okay, then the fable would apply. If you cut, if you cut off the belly, then it doesn't have the ability to support the church. On the other hand, I think that the church had its own lands, it had its own ability to try to get money from people. But if the nobility cut it off, it would be in worse shape. So it's in a slightly different zone than the people, right? If the people could be easily damaged by a weakened nobility. Now, how is that? Let's talk about the relationship between the people and the nobles. If the nobles are weakened now because the people don't feed them, so to speak, why does that damage the people? Because he comes back and says they are hurt by this.
Because then they're defenseless.
Yeah, the nobles, that they provide protection and they provide structure. Okay, and of course everybody knew and knows that protection was not perfect, and sometimes it was abused. Okay, and Marie knows that too, but she's pointing out they serve this fundamental purpose, and so they're not just leeches. Okay, they do serve a purpose, and if you take away their power, then you're defenseless. Okay, so every part of society serves a purpose, even that part that you resent. But you're right about the head, and that's a curious omission. Maybe she doesn't know exactly what to do with that because she doesn't want to see the church as completely dependent upon the nobles. Okay? But she concludes with a different version than the original tale. In the original tale, the body dies, and so you have this striking, oh my God, what have we just done, sort of response, or at least that's what it's supposed to elicit. But she substitutes that ending with, no one can have honor who brings shame to his Lord, nor can his Lord have it either if he wishes to shame his people. If either one fails, the other evil befalls them both. So she substitutes the ending with her own lesson. It basically supports the same idea, but she explicitly gives you the lesson there, that the loyalty, the honor needs to be given to the Lord, but the Lord also needs to take care of his people. Okay? The Lord can't have the honor either if he wishes to shame his people, which is a delicate way to put, that the Lord has a responsibility, to take care of his people. If the Lord is abusive and takes more than he needs and angers people to the point where they're not as productive, then he will be damaged by it. Okay? And she adds the moral element of shame. Okay? And honor and shame is a very big theme during the Middle Ages. You either have honor or you bring shame upon yourself and others. Okay? So again, we see this mutual dependency. Okay? And it goes both ways. Okay? And so she also emphasizes the responsibility of these lords to not abuse their power. And this was a frequent refrain in medieval political thought. There's a constant, drumbeat. You need to be responsible. Okay? You need to take care of people. You need to not abuse your power. All right? So, even though it's just a little story, we get a lot out of it, a basic idea, and we can see the influence of the ancient Greeks coming through in it. For instance, the idea that some people are inherently superior to others. Okay? This small tale does not support the idea of inherent superiority. It supports the idea of roles. Okay? But everybody is mutually dependent upon each other. They're interdependent. Okay? And so it does strike a little blow at this idea that we're superior to you to the point where we don't have to listen to you. We don't have to pay attention to you. And we see there a similar reference or a similar idea to what is developed by Aristotle. Okay? That every human being, every citizen anyway, is capable of thinking for himself and of passing judgment and of participating. Okay? And we have the idea of power based upon consent coming out a little bit here because of the mutual expectations. And the idea that one party can decide to stop doing its part. Okay? That's a startling idea. It would have been a startling idea to a lot of people. That one party could contemplate stopping its role, not doing its role. And if it did, what would happen? Okay? And finally, very much, the idea that government is there to improve its people, not just to feed on them and use them.